The asphalt of a legendary streetball court is not merely a surface, it is an unforgiving archive of human ego, a living, breathing testament to the triumphs and humiliations that unfold under the brutal heat of the afternoon sun. If you stand on the periphery of these hallowed grounds, whether it is the chain-link fortress of Rucker Park in New York or the salt-sprayed concrete of Venice Beach, you can feel the residual, chaotic energy of countless battles vibrating through the soles of your shoes. Out here, the sterile, polite rules of organized basketball do not apply. There are no polished hardwood floors to cushion a devastating fall, no sympathetic referees armed with whistles to save you from a physical mismatch, and absolutely no room for the fragile or the unprepared. Streetball is a visceral, unfiltered meritocracy built on a foundation of raw athletic power, psychological intimidation, and the kind of public, soul-crushing humiliation that can permanently erase a man's reputation before the streetlights even flicker on. It is a predatory ecosystem that demands spectacle, thrives on confrontation, and feeds on the energy of a crowd perpetually hungry for a fresh victim. To step onto this court is to sign a primal contract. Your dignity is currency, and you are only as safe as your last dominant play. On this particular, sweltering day, the court belonged entirely to one absolute terrifying force of nature. He was a colossus, a towering monument of pure muscle, explosive kinetic energy, and supreme, unchecked arrogance who stood a staggering 7 feet and 2 inches tall. He was not just playing the game, he was a localized atmospheric event, the undisputed king of the concrete, an apex predator in a fenced-in jungle who possessed the supreme toxic confidence of a man who had never been truly challenged. Every single time his massive hands engulfed the worn leather of the basketball, the surrounding crowd buzzed with a potent electric mixture of anticipation and dread, parting slightly as if bracing for an explosion. He did not merely defeat his opponents, he systematically and joyfully dismantled them, both physically and psychologically, leaving a trail of broken pride in his wake. He blocked shots with such vicious, downward ferocity that the ball would routinely ricochet violently into the surrounding chain-link fence, sending onlookers scrambling backward. He threw down thunderous, gravity-defying dunks that made the rusty metal backboard scream and shudder in sheer agony, the sound echoing off the surrounding urban architecture like a warning shot to anyone foolish enough to lace up their sneakers. And perhaps most devastatingly, he accompanied every single display of physical dominance with a relentless, booming stream of cruel, surgical trash talk designed to break a man's spirit before breaking his ankles. He was an anomaly of genetics and swagger, blending the raw, immovable power of a traditional center with the fluid, terrifying agility of a modern guard. For anyone watching from the sidelines, leaning against the fence with wide, disbelieving eyes, the narrative of the day was already firmly etched into the asphalt. This giant was invincible, a literal god among mortals, and he was reveling in every single second of his unquestioned, tyrannical supremacy. The air was thick with his dominance, the heat shimmering off the blacktop mirroring the intensity of his reign, and it seemed absolutely certain that no one in the city, perhaps no one on earth, could possibly dethrone him on this day. Then, without warning, the atmospheric pressure of the court fundamentally shifted, not with a thunderous roar or a flashy, highly anticipated entrance, but with the quiet, almost unremarkable squeak of the chain-link gate swinging open. The kinetic frenzy of the court, usually a relentless vortex of constant motion, shouting, and squeaking rubber, momentarily stalled as if an invisible director had yelled, "Cut!" The crowd, previously whipped into a chaotic frenzy by the giant's relentless aerial assaults, fell into a confused, murmuring hush, their eyes slowly drawn away from the airborne titan and toward the perimeter. Walking onto the edge of the court was a man who looked like he had taken a profoundly wrong turn on his way to a suburban hardware store or a neighborhood barbecue. He was a tall, undeniably pale, middle-aged man who moved with a notoriously bad back, exhibiting a stiff, almost painful, flat-footed gait that stood in stark, almost comical contrast to the fluid grace and explosive athleticism of the streetball gladiators surrounding him. He was not wearing the vibrant, breathable athletic gear, the cutting-edge signature sneakers, or the flashy, sweat-wicking accessories that defined the local, hyper-competitive culture. Instead, he was dressed in faded, rigid denim jeans and a loose, unremarkable polo shirt that hung awkwardly on his frame, his feet encased in sensible, worn-out shoes that looked entirely unsuited for the sudden stops and explosive jumps of the game. The visual dissonance was absolute, jarring, and almost surreal. He looked like a lost father searching for his son, or perhaps a bewildered tourist who had wandered far too far from the relative safety of the commercial boardwalk and stumbled into a war zone. But as he stepped closer, moving slowly and deliberately into the harsh, unforgiving sunlight, the quiet murmurs rippling through the dense crowd began to fundamentally change pitch and tempo. The initial wave of confusion and amusement began to morph into something else, something resembling disbelief, as recognition flickered, then flared brightly, in the eyes of the older, more seasoned spectators who truly understood the history of the game. The stiff, deliberate walk, the pale complexion, the shock of blonde hair, and most importantly, the cold, dead-eyed, predatory stare that seemed to look right through the surrounding chaos and noise. It all belonged to a living, breathing ghost of the hardwood, a myth who had somehow materialized on the blacktop. The giant, flush with the intoxicating adrenaline of his uncontested, hours-long reign, and completely blind to the historical gravity of the moment, paused his relentless dominance to look down at the intruder from his elevated, godlike vantage point. Over 7 feet in the air, peering down through the shimmering heat waves, the man in the jeans looked to him like a pathetic joke, a minor, irritating glitch in the matrix of his perfect, dominant afternoon that needed to be swatted away like a bothersome insect. The giant's ego, dangerously inflated by hours of mercilessly destroying local legends, high school hopefuls, and anyone else foolish enough to step between the lines, demanded a fresh public sacrifice to entertain his loyal congregation. Bounced the ball heavily on the cracked asphalt, the deep, resonant sound echoing like a heavy judge's gavel demanding immediate order in his court, and confidently, aggressively walked over to the edge of the paint where the anomaly stood motionless. He looked down at the middle-aged man, a condescending, razor-sharp smirk stretching across his sweat-drenched face, exposing his absolute, unwavering certainty in his own physical supremacy and youth. He did not see 3 NBA Most Valuable Player awards, 3 championship rings, or a legacy carved out of pure competitive malice. He did not see a man who had fearlessly walked into the most hostile, deafening arenas in the world, faced down the greatest athletes of his generation, and surgically, joyfully ripped the beating heart out of entire legendary franchises with a smile on his face. He did not see the architect of some of the most brilliant, high-stakes, ruthless basketball ever played in the history of the sport. He only saw a stiff, aging, fragile man in highly inappropriate clothing who was trespassing on his personal kingdom. The giant leaned down, away, the sweat visibly dripping from his chin onto the baking pavement, and delivered what he genuinely, foolishly believed would be the final, devastating punchline to the joke of this man's presence, utilizing a tone dripping with pure, unadulterated disrespect. 3 simple words left his lips, loud enough for the entire silenced crowd to hear, meant to instantly banish the old man and reassert his absolute authority over the domain. Go home, Grandpa. It was the ultimate point of no return. The exact moment the oxygen seemed to be instantly sucked out of the park, creating a vacuum of profound, suffocating tension. The crowd, an entity always hungry for confrontation and uniquely attuned to the subtle shifts in respect and disrespect, inhaled sharply, a collective gasp that signaled the crossing of an invisible, sacred line. In the hyper-masculine, deeply territorial ecosystem of street basketball, an insult of that magnitude, delivered directly and unapologetically to a man's face in front of an audience, demands an immediate, undeniable physical response. It demands a fight, a violent escalation, or a shameful, immediate retreat with one's head bowed. But the man in the denim jeans did absolutely none of those things. He did not flinch, he did not angrily puff out his chest in a show of false bravado, he did not raise his voice to defend his honor, and he certainly did not retreat. Instead, Larry Bird simply took a slow, deliberate step onto the court, his eyes locking onto the giant with a terrifying hollow emptiness that signaled the beginning of an intellectual and physical execution. He did not ask for the ball, he simply stood there, radiating an invisible, crushing weight, waiting for the inevitable. The giant, laughing a deep, booming laugh that echoed off the concrete, tossed the ball lazily to Bird, a gesture of profound, theatrical mockery designed to entertain his disciples. He was literally giving the old man a free possession, an open invitation to humiliate himself under the unforgiving microscopic scrutiny of the streetball congregation, confident that the ensuing failure would be legendary. The giant bent his massive knees slightly, dropping into a wide, imposing defensive stance, spreading his impossibly long arms and casting a dark, looming shadow that completely swallowed Bird's stiff frame entirely. The visual contrast was almost comical. A scene lifted straight from a cartoon, the towering, heavily muscled titan in his absolute athletic prime, bursting with kinetic potential, completely enveloping the stiff, awkwardly dressed, visibly aging veteran who looked like he could barely bend over to tie his shoes. It looked exactly like a starving lion toying with a wounded, helpless gazelle before the inevitable, bloody kill. But the giant, blinded by his own towering ego and his complete reliance on fast-twitch muscle fibers, was entirely oblivious to the invisible, deadly variable operating right in front of his eyes. He did not fundamentally understand that basketball, when elevated to its absolute highest, most elite level, is no longer a rudimentary game of inches, vertical leaps, and raw sprint speeds. It transforms into a highly complex, psychological game of microscopic angles, perfect timing, and merciless anticipatory warfare. And he had just willingly, arrogantly handed the basketball to the grandmaster of the discipline, completely unaware that he had just stepped onto a chessboard where he was playing checkers. What unfolded over the next few seconds did not take minutes or hours to develop. It was a fleeting, microscopic window of time, but those precious seconds contained a masterclass in the absolute molecular destruction of a human ego, a sequence that would be burned into the retinas of everyone present. Bird caught the heavy leather ball, his massive, calloused hands instantly finding the familiar grooves and seams without him even having to look down. He did not immediately drop into an aggressive, explosive triple threat stance like a younger player might. He stood remarkably, dangerously upright, his legs straight, the ball resting comfortably and loosely in his hands. His eyes completely and utterly ignored the massive, imposing chest of the defender towering over him, bypassing the physical threat entirely. Bird's pale blue eyes were locked entirely with laser-like focus on the distant orange rim, calculating the distance, the wind, and the exact trajectory required for a lethal strike. The giant, eager to swat the inevitable, weak shot into the neighboring postal code and cement his legend for the day, aggressively closed the remaining distance, suffocating Bird's airspace and completely eliminating any physical room to operate. He was relying entirely on the fundamental, unquestioned logic of the streetball court. Overwhelming size always suffocates inferior skill, and youth always conquers age. But Larry Bird was not operating on the same rudimentary physical plane. He was running a completely different, vastly superior algorithm in his mind, processing variables the giant didn't even know existed. He understood the giant's psychology perfectly, reading his aggressive posture and his desperate need for validation like a brightly lit billboard. He knew with absolute certainty that the giant was desperate for the block, starving for the highlight reel play, and practically vibrating with the need to definitively prove to the watching crowd that the concept of the grandpa was obsolete and pathetic. The giant was a tightly coiled spring of pure physical aggression, operating entirely on instinct and ego, and Bird calmly, coolly held the sole release mechanism in his hands. Without any warning, without any preliminary twitch or tell, Bird executed a pump fake, but it was not a violent, exaggerated theatrical motion designed to draw a cheap foul. It was a masterpiece of subtle, surgical, and absolutely flawless biomechanics, a movement honed over millions of lonely repetitions in empty gyms. It consisted of a microscopic dip of his right shoulder, a perfectly timed subtle elevation of both elbows, and most importantly, a sudden sharp flick of his eyes directly up toward the basket. It was a composite movement so deeply ingrained with the exact, authentic biometric signature of a genuine, lethal jump shot that the giant's central nervous system bypassed his conscious brain entirely, acting on pure, undeniable reflex. The giant bit on the fake, he bit with his entire soul, his ego overriding any semblance of defensive discipline. Relying on his supreme, unquestioned athleticism, the 7'2" behemoth launched himself violently into the air with terrifying, explosive force. His massive hand reaching its absolute apex height, his muscles straining as he entirely expected to meet the leather of the basketball and violently send it into the stratosphere. But the ball was simply not there. Bird had not left his feet. His sensible, worn-out shoes were still planted firmly, flatly on the boiling asphalt. As the giant flew helplessly through the air, completely untethered from the earth, entirely out of the play, and suddenly realizing the catastrophic magnitude of his error, time itself seemed to fundamentally slow down for everyone watching. Bird, still standing incredibly flat-footed in his rigid denim jeans, slowly, almost casually brought the ball back down to his chest, refusing to rush, refusing to panic, entirely immune to the violent kinetic energy exploding just inches above his head. He let the massive giant sail past him, turning the terrifying defender into a massive, helpless, flailing satellite, falling rapidly and embarrassingly out of orbit. In that agonizing fraction of a second, while the giant was awkwardly suspended in the air, gravity beginning to take its inevitable hold, pulling him down toward the reality of his humiliation, Bird didn't just prepare to shoot the wide-open basketball. He methodically, ruthlessly twisted the psychological knife deep into the giant's shattered pride. With the colossal defender floating hopelessly out of bounds, completely unable to alter his trajectory or stop the impending doom, Bird turned his head and looked directly into the panicked eyes of the descending Leviathan. He didn't yell, he didn't scream, and he didn't contort his face in anger. He simply let go of a few quiet, surgically precise, devastating words of his legendary trash talk, a quiet whisper of absolute, undeniable dominance delivered straight into the shattering core of the Titan's ego, while he was completely powerless to respond. Then, and only then, with the defender completely removed from the equation and the crowd holding its collective breath, did Bird slowly, methodically rise for the actual shot. His release was absolute poetry in motion, a stark, breathtaking contrast to his previously stiff, painful walk, revealing the true, enduring genius hidden beneath the faded clothing. The mechanical execution was utterly flawless, a perfect symmetrical replication of the millions of identical shots he had taken throughout his life. The ball left his calloused fingertips with exquisite, mathematically perfect backspin, tracing a high, beautiful, agonizingly slow parabola against the hazy, polluted afternoon sky, suspended in the air like a final judgment. Bird didn't even bother to watch the ball reach the majestic apex of its flight. The moment the leather left his hand, his internal mathematics were already completely solved, and he knew with absolute terrifying certainty that the shot was perfect. Before the ball even began its rapid, inevitable descent toward the iron, Larry Bird simply turned his back to the basket, a gesture of supreme, almost insulting confidence. He immediately started walking slowly toward the chain-link gate, his hands casually, almost lazily dropping to his sides, his bad back instantly forcing the return of that familiar, stiff-legged, awkward gait that had initially drawn so much mockery. Behind him, high in the air, the ball finally met its target, and it did not clank against the iron, nor did it graze the square of the glass backboard. It was a perfect, devastating, silencing swish, dropping cleanly through the exact dead center of the cylinder. The heavy, rusted chain-link net whipped violently upward with a sharp, metallic, definitive snap that echoed like a gunshot across the sudden, terrifying, absolute silence of the sun-baked asphalt. For a long, agonizing moment, the entire park was completely paralyzed, trapped in a state of collective shock. The giant landed heavily, awkwardly on the concrete, his massive momentum carrying him stumbling out of bounds, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and horror, his massive chest heaving as he stared blankly at the swinging metal net. He slowly turned to look back at the court, then at the slowly retreating, denim-clad figure walking toward the exit. The absolute, undisputed king of the court, the terrifying monster who had mercilessly terrorized the neighborhood and dominated every challenger all afternoon, had been instantly reduced to a completely helpless, humiliated bystander in his own physical domain. He had been conceptually, psychologically, and physically dismantled, exposed, and destroyed in the span of a single agonizing possession that required his opponent to barely leave the ground. The heavy silence held for exactly one more collective heartbeat, a vacuum of disbelief, and then the entire court absolutely erupted. It was not a standard cheer for a good play, it was a massive, riotous detonation of disbelief, a chaotic explosion of collective shock and primal awe. Spectators wildly grabbed their heads in disbelief, screamed indiscriminately at the sky, sprinted wildly onto the court in chaotic circles, and shoved each other in pure, unadulterated astonishment. They weren't just celebrating a made jump shot, they were viscerally reacting to a localized, undeniable act of God, a tear in the fabric of their reality. They had just witnessed the complete, undeniable inversion of the physical universe they understood. The biggest, strongest, fastest, most terrifyingly arrogant man on the pavement had been completely and utterly erased from existence by a stiff, aging man who looked like he belonged behind the steering wheel of a riding lawnmower. But Larry Bird didn't stop his slow walk to acknowledge the chaotic explosion of noise behind him. He didn't raise his arms in a triumphant victory pose, he didn't look back over his shoulder to gloat at the broken, humiliated giant, and he didn't seek any validation from the screaming disciples of the streetball church. He simply pushed open the squeaking chain-link gate, stepped out onto the sidewalk, and quietly disappeared into the hazy afternoon, leaving behind a smoldering psychological crater exactly where a terrifying streetball legend used to stand just moments before. This is the ultimate invisible danger of the court, the profound, enduring truth that survives and outlasts every single era, every stylistic shift, and every physical evolution of the game of basketball. Physical advantages, overwhelming height, blazing speed, explosive vertical leaps, and raw brute strength are incredibly loud. They naturally demand immediate attention, they easily intimidate the weak, and they can completely dominate the uninitiated or the fearful. But true, deeply rooted competitive genius is always quiet, incredibly patient, and terrifyingly analytical. It does not need to scream to be heard, and it does not need to jump out of the gym to destroy you. When supreme, unchecked physical arrogance violently collides with absolute, battle-tested, hyper-intelligent mastery, the resulting event is never actually a contest, it is a meticulously planned, inevitable execution. The giant learned the absolute hardest, most unforgiving lesson that the asphalt has to offer to those who disrespect the history of the game. You can jump as incredibly high as humanly possible, you can possess all the fast twitch muscles in the world, and you can intimidate everyone in the park, but you can never, ever jump higher than a quiet, brilliant man who already knows exactly where, when, and how hard you are going to land. Youth, explosive power, and physical dominance are fleeting, temporary gifts that will inevitably fade and betray you with time, but the cold, calculating intelligence required to absolutely, thoroughly humiliate your opponent without even breaking a sweat or leaving your feet, that is immortal.